Matt Sherman, Greg Jaffe, thank you both for being here. Thanks for all that you've done over this long period of time.
Thank you, Doug.
I'm Doug Blackmon. See you next week.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today. Question specifically for the civilians in Iraqi Iraq.
The Afghan civilians.
The Afghan civilians in Iraqi Iraq. I don't know that you can speak for them, but you're probably a much better voice for them than anything else we have. What are their thoughts about the Americans being there and the Americans leaving?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that they always, what was interesting was when we initially went there, with me and the brigade commander that I worked with, we went there in February of 2009, so it was cold. And we went there and you just saw the market empty for the most part. You saw a lot of literally old Russian vehicles that were just gutted. There was a small little memorial that was there that they kind of preserved. And it was just very muddy and just, you just wondered how people could live here. And one of the comments that one Afghan that we talked to is, and we were talking about how we're going to help provide resources and da-da-da-da-da. And I think one of the comments that really stood with me was, listen, this is the Afghan speaking, we live, he said, 50 kilometers from Kabul, and this is how we live. And so their thoughts and hopes for anything, was really non-existent in many ways. And then when you're then providing, I think they definitely are thankful that you're able to kind of help inject all these resources that are in there. But they also believe that you're not going to stay. You're not going to be able to continue to help. And our always thought was what we want to do is to be able to transition so these things can happen. And I think it's unfortunate that I think in some of these environments, since a lot of these Afghans have not had anything for so many years, and now that they're overwhelmed, or they were overwhelmed with so many resources, it creates this kind of hoarding mentality because they don't think that it's going to be around for a while. And as a result, they just get as much as they can and to be able to keep for themselves, or their family, or their tribe. And as a result, it frustrates the process. But it also then, he's doing it because historically, that's the only way that you're able to survive in these sorts of environments. I hope that answers your question a bit.
Sure. Go to the back. And then we leave, of course.
And then we do leave.
Affirming.
And it's something that and I told you so sort of thing. And then the particularly American soldiers, and also at that time the State Department people, but we try giving you an opportunity, and so there's this divide, and this saying, we're trying to give you an opportunity in order to do this, but they kind of have, but you're going to leave, and so as a result, a lot of these times these efforts are frustrated, even though there's good efforts and good intentions that initiate these sort of things.
And they know the enemy's going to stay too.
Yeah.
The Taliban in some cases aren't some outside force, but they're the lost brothers from that particular village.
And I think that's one of the underlying difficulties with COIN, is that it's difficult to break through that divide, because you're not only dealing with individuals, at that point in time or during that tour, you're dealing with his mentality, his history, his perception for 20, 30, 40 years that he's lived there. And this is how he's got to continue to live beyond it. And that's a very difficult thing in order to overcome. In many ways, you're just not going to be able to overcome it.
Hi, thank you for your service. Thank you for being in Afghanistan and Iraq. What was Bremer thinking when he disbanded the Army? Did he consult the ministry? Did he consult anybody? Just, thought it was a good idea and just...
Well, I don't want to defend or speak for Ambassador Bremer, and that happened before I got there. The way just to tie it to how I was impacted by that decision, is that Bremer, as many of you know, in 2003 disbanded the Iraqi army, and it had a real detrimental effect because you just more or less wiped away the entire Iraqi army. But what was important from my perspective is that the Iraqi police, though, was the only security force as a result that was still in place. And that had a whole other set of consequences, for better and for worse, that we then had to deal with. So as you're moving along in this conflict, a whole host of resources are then focused on rebuilding the Iraqi army. And the U.S. military, for the most part, was primarily focused on that effort, and and time and advisors and a whole host of things that we're doing. The Iraqi police, on the other hand, it was just a fraction of that, even though that was the security force that was in place. And this gets to the point that I was raising earlier, is that many times, our institutions will then build one that's kind of in line with who they are as well. And that helped build up the Iraqi army to some degree. And some people were saying, well, if the Iraqi police was disbanded as well, then we would have rebuilt that in a much more robust way. And so that was the argument that was put forward at that time. But, again, I'm speaking only because I worked with the police. Police are much more difficult the police force is much more difficult to establish and reconstitute than an army is. And one of the frustrations that I had at that time was that we were over-militarizing the police. And a lot of times when we equated security forces, we equated an army soldier on the same par with a police soldier, and Israel had to arm them in a comparable way. And no, they're fundamentally different missions that they have. But developing a policeman is much more difficult. And then you're going about it in a country and in an environment that historically the police are corrupt and abusive officials as an arm of the government. That historically been that case in Iraq. So you're dealing with that whole problem. So you have all these other sort of underlining issues that many people in the U.S. may not have appreciated, but that we had to then contend with. And it was a real problem. And so, sorry to keep going on this, because I had to deal with this for 2 years and the consequences of it for a long time, is that a lot of time, in the military, we have a thing called operational control, OPCON. And so when they were rebuilding the Iraqi army, they were OPCONed to the U.S. military. So they're in direct control of them. So they were able to help rebuild them, help direct them, and all. This is during the early years of Iraq. The Iraqi police were not OPCONed. There was no control that the U.S. Army had, the U.S. forces had over them. And so as a result, they were much more of a political pawn by the Iraqi government. And so when you then had a Shiite government that kind of came in, and particularly those that had sectarian agendas that was aligned with them, they used certain segments of the police in order to carry out political vendettas quite a bit. And so they were then abused in that way. And there was difficult ways in how we were able then to be able to mitigate that and address that sort of issue because of the human rights of issues that were addressed and all the political, a whole host of things that then you're in the middle of. And again, it's another level of detail and frustration that you deal with in that sort of situation. In many ways, coming from that initial action a number of years prior.
And when we say militarized, I mean, they really did look like military units. They had armored vehicles and mortars and machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. I mean, they looked like they were a force ready to, take down a city.
And in many ways, that's what they wanted. A lot of the Ministry of Interior police leadership wanted, because they were former military or their relatives were former military. And that, the military is something that was held in very high regard, and because they carried authority, they carried power and all this other stuff. And you're able to do that based upon additional guns and resources and vehicles that you had, and that fed into that whole sort of process.
It was a catch-22 too, because if you didn't give them all that stuff, then they're sitting alone and afraid out on this checkpoint, and they just get slaughtered because they were the easiest target. So you almost didn't have a choice but to militarize them, or they just get
killed.
Steamrolled. Yeah.
So when you were talking about levels of involvement of our military, I heard you use the word threat, and that made me think, what would be the threat to us, dependent on that level of involvement? Or even if we were to not be involved. So just your opinion, what would be the threat to us?
Well, I think that the real concern is that, first and foremost, is that the threat would be another 9/11 sort of attack. And I know there's a whole host of efforts that have been done to mitigate that since then. But also just given the transnational nature that a lot of these enemies are now able to carry out and project, as we've been seeing in Belgium, we've seen in Paris and elsewhere. And how are you able to deal with that? I think we as a government have done a very good job at being able to diversify how we address it. So it's not necessarily just a military problem to address, but it is an intelligence issue, it's a diplomatic one, it's a homeland security sort of issue. And so there's multiple facets of doing it. But again, in this part, and we're talking particularly with regards to Afghanistan, this is an area of the world where these sorts of threats have originated for decades, many, many decades, for a whole host of reasons that we'll probably never be able to contend. And so in my mind, is it important for us to be able to work with some sort of host government and to be able to have an ability to have some sort of presence there in order to deal and to combat these sorts of threats at their source. And in my viewpoint, it is. It took us a long time to be able to get there, but we have finally kind of gotten there. Now, is it at the right level of involvement with regards to financial contributions or with regards to military personnel? I think that's going to continuously evolve and change. But again, it's I think with the policy intent of dealing with these threats from where they have originated, if history is any course, so that they don't necessarily come back and threaten partners, because coalition partners, because of how NATO is structured, and then also threaten, at least importantly for us, threaten here in the U.S.
This is more an observation than a question. I did 13 months in Vietnam. It sounds like we did not learn a lot of the lessons there, that we've made some of the same mistakes. One wonders whether we will ever learn some of these things.
I like to think that we have to some degree, but certainly not as much as I would like. But it's also part of the reason why I stayed out there for so long, is so that some of the lessons that I did learn, good and bad, could then be imparted and shared, and perspectives could be imparted and shared with people who were in positions of command and authority that were there. Because you do see yourself repeating these things time and time again. I mean, one of the, just to tie into both of my Iraq and Afghanistan tours. So I was very defined, as I was talking to before, in Iraq, where segments of the police were then used for political vendettas. And that really, it impacted the country a lot and it impacted me personally a lot, because you're seeing this happening and you're just being so incredibly frustrated with how these things were unfolding. That embedded with me tremendously. And it's something that I then took with me to Afghanistan, where I worked as much as I could to try to make sure that measures were taken to mitigate against that. Now, historically, the Afghan security forces aren't necessarily used that way, but still, there were things that we could do in order to mitigate that with regards to certain intelligence assets, how we went about our training, how we're able to kind of cross-lead who's kind of recruiting these people, and so you're able to have a bit more of a melded force. So that sort of problem doesn't repeat itself in Afghanistan. Is that something that's overlooked and missed by most of America? Absolutely. But for me, it was so important because the sectarianism, tribalism in Iraq is really, of the security forces, is really what has undone so many things that are there because of how that was structured.
Though it's interesting to me that the specific reference, I remember asking someone, I don't remember who the guest was, but very soon after I started doing this, so 3.5 years ago probably, and asking a guest who either had been a fairly high-ranking military figure or State Department type, and saying, gosh, as we begin to look seriously at a really big withdrawal from here, lots of discussion of building up I think we were talking about the Iraq military, and I invoked the experience of Vietnam and the SVA and our efforts to build up the South Vietnamese Army at the end, and all the things that were being said at that time about the SVA taking over from U.S. armed forces and all they were going to do. And then we left, and they were just like the Iraqis last year. Were stripping off their uniforms and running as fast as they could. But whoever the guest was at the time just scoffed at the question. There was, this is nothing like Vietnam. This is nothing like the SVA. It's ridiculous to even compare the efforts that were underway. But in the end, it really did look strikingly similar, at least from the outside.
And I think this goes to the importance of why having some sort of continued, prolonged presence is so important. And I was thinking,
like in Afghanistan.
Like in Afghanistan,
right?
And how we look at these sorts of wars. We look at wars nowadays in terms of in the end of a war, like the end of World War II, and the signing between Japanese and U.S. representatives on the USS Missouri in 1945, and there's that culmination. But that doesn't necessarily happen when you're fighting a non-state actor, and so you're in a much different area. And so it made me start thinking, what sort of event can there be, or should there be, in order to kind of culminate that sort of event of some sort. And in many ways, it's signing a bilateral security agreement with that host government. And that because of how these conflicts have been, you've spent so much time and resources building up those institutions, building up those systems, for better or for worse, that you're then able to sign an agreement, a peaceful agreement, a partnership with that host government. And that was not achieved in Iraq in 2011. And as a result, all of the forces left. It was able to be achieved in Afghanistan in September of 2014. It almost didn't happen, but that's important. That's very important, I think, just in terms of signaling to the host nation, signaling to the international community that you are going to have some sort of long-term investment that's here, and that it's welcome. And that is so important. That shouldn't be discounted. That gets overlooked a lot, I know, but it really is fundamentally important. And it could be some sort of, as history kind of looks back on these conflicts, I could see that sort of signing that we had in Kabul in September of 2014 being on par with the sort of signing that you had on the USS Missouri in 1945.
Well, speaking of long-term investment, what are your observations about the effect of these wars on children, families, and refugees?
It's devastating. I have stayed in touch with many Iraqi and Afghan citizens, and they're the ones who are impacted most of all by all these things. And I've helped a number of them try to get over here to the U.S. I've tried to help a number of them just in many ways possible, because you become personally vested in a lot of them, and that's something that and again, that's why I have stayed involved in so long, because you are personally vested in these things. And again, I don't pretend to have the answer for this, but it doesn't go unnoticed for me, and it's why these sorts of wars, and I suspect will always be with me for a long time, and I suspect there will be other parts of my career when I go back to those areas, go back to those countries, and to be able to kind of continuously address these issues, even though there'll still be many problems that we're still repeating. I'm like going, gosh dang it, we were dealing with this in 2005. What that, and hopefully I'll be at some position where, those frustrations may actually be listened in a wider forum or among more other decision makers, so that we don't necessarily go down those roads.
One of the differences of Vietnam is we lost and we got to go home. That hasn't been an opportunity, it seems, in this war. Going forward, one wonders if carrying on all these things isn't to justify what has already happened to all the soldiers and all the people and all the Afghans and all the families that have been wiped out and families on this side that have been destroyed. Is carrying forward and dragging this on a way to justify that? Or can we just say, we lost and come home?
I don't know if you wanted to also address that. I can as well.
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument sometimes you hear in the White House that, gosh, we've been doing this for 15 years. What makes us think that, another 15 is going to produce a significantly different result? I guess my argument would be we have learned things over the last 15 years, and it does take time to change a culture. And I guess the question then becomes, what's a reasonable cost? You know, if you can invest, you know, we've got 10,000 troops there now, not 100,000, which is what we had at the peak. In Afghanistan, you know, the losses are felt here hard at home, but it's a relatively small number. You know, we're losing less than a dozen or so soldiers a year, I would say, less than 2 dozen. You know, the costs are somewhere between $10 and $15 billion a year, I would guess right now. And the question is, you know, is that an acceptable cost to do that for the next 15 years if you can sustain, if you can build something that's sustainable, if that's what it takes? And so my hope is, after years of essentially what Matt described, overwhelming the problem, which sort of stunts the locals from doing it because you're doing it for them and you've got so many more resources, that maybe something that's small and looks a lot uglier has a better chance of surviving.
Just to also address your issue, because I think it's a very important one. One of the fundamental differences between Vietnam and Iraq and Afghanistan, at least from a soldier's perspective, is that you have an all-volunteer force now. And so all of those who volunteer to serve, in many ways have an understanding of what they're getting into. And they've known, at least over the past decade, that the chances of going to Iraq or Afghanistan were incredibly high. So they knew that was part of the thing. Vietnam, when you had the draft, it was somewhat different. Second point of that is the way in how you deal with expectations and how you have those debates and discussions with the American public. And are you going to be able to kind of have Baraki Baraks, at least how they were, spread throughout the, no, they're not. And so in many ways, you've really tailored down the expectations to really some of the bare essentials that you need to do. And you know, the mission that we have in Afghanistan right now is very, very, very narrow. It's specifically tailored and defined. The only enemies that the US military is allowed to target is Al-Qaeda and Daesh, and that's it. And then their other mission is to train and advise the Iraqis, and in that they provide support. I'm sorry, the Afghans is in order to train and advise and be able to assist them. That is a much, much, much narrower mission than what we saw in 09, 10, 11, 12, 13 in Iraq, in Afghanistan. So it's a fundamentally different sort of mission.
What's interesting to me, this president, for all his eloquence, and I think he can be, you know, is one of our most eloquent speakers, has really struggled to explain, I think, what we're doing and why we're doing it in a way that the American people can understand. And I don't know if that's because he hasn't tried hard enough. I don't know if it's just because it's really hard to explain something that looks less than total victory to people in a way that they can understand and engage. But that's one thing that's been striking to me, that it's really been hard to articulate what we're doing and why we're doing it and why it matters.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think we probably should stop there. Thank you again very much.
Thank you.